The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you so much, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. Each week, we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. This week, we're pleased to have with us Ivan Soto. Ivan's Director of Manufacturing Validation for Emergent BioSolutions. And I did want to note that the views expressed in this podcast are those of Ivan's alone and do not represent the views of Emergent BioSolutions. So with that said, welcome with us today, Ivan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How you doing?
Good, thanks. Glad to be here.
Yes, I'm glad to have you here. Today, Ivan, we're talking about implementing quality metrics for validation. A classic topic, but one that people are always looking for more information on. So this should be a great chat.
Awesome.
So quality metrics for our listeners are used throughout the pharmaceutical industry, and they're essential in monitoring quality control systems and processes, driving continuous improvement efforts, and providing data necessary to develop compliance inspection policies and practices in drug manufacturing. So with that said, Ivan, GMP or good manufacturing processes compliance means manufacturers must use an ongoing program to maintain and evaluate product and process data that relate to the quality of the products, of course. So in your experience, what are some of the current challenges with the implementation of quality metrics for validation?
Yes, Stacey, so some of the challenges is that the guidance provided by the FDA is very driven to the product, which is fine. It's absolutely perfect. We're very safety and product quality oriented in the industry. But one of the challenges is that there's no relationship between what we are expecting or the FDA is saying or their guidance about quality metrics and then providing some direction in terms of validation metrics. So when you look at the guidance document from the FDA, it's very driven to low acceptance rates, product quality complaint rates, and invalidated out of specification rates, which are very, very good indicators of quality. The problem is that falls short of providing guidance to the validation community on those metrics that have a relationship to these metrics that the FDA is expecting, and then translating those into validation metrics. The other problem that we have in the industry as well is that we're not really sometimes collecting and tracking relevant validation metrics and data. So if you're not collecting the data, you're not tracking the data, it's obviously very challenging to establish a metric program for validation. And then also there's a lot of lack of understanding of what's critical and an indicator of quality in validation. Then to add up to that, you have inadequate procedures for protocol deviations and categories of protocol deviations. So that dilutes a little bit the data, and then obviously makes it a little bit of a challenge to implement quality validation metrics. And then in some cases, they are not very considered important. So, a lot of cases we more geared toward metrics that speak to the quality of the product, and we forget about validation and their relationship of those metrics on validation as it relates to the life cycle of the product and the equipment as well.
So regulatory agencies are regularly looking for strong processes first, I think, in my experience. That's been one of the major findings when they go into pharmaceutical companies, is that sometimes the processes are not in place, or correct processes or thorough processes. But it sounds like you're saying that a lot of these companies even when they do have a great process in place and hopefully all the programs necessary to ensure quality, that they're missing the metrics piece. Is that true?
Yeah, in most cases, what I think is that they missing a clear definition of what is an adequate metric for validation and an indicator of the quality of the process, and not just the process, is the equipment and systems that the process supports.
Sure. So we're talking about metrics that would be most useful in supporting the overall process of the validation lifecycle and or PQS, pharmaceutical quality system assessment. Can you describe what types of metrics you're talking about?
Yes. So when we're looking at metrics for validation, we really want to define and provide operational definitions for metrics that provide us an understanding of the quality of the validation program in relation to the product and the equipment that it supports. Okay. So in validation, we execute protocols, right?
Right.
Execution of protocols are used to determine whether a specific system or process or equipment meet the intended use, meet the specifications that are in place for it, and it meets expectations, right? So sometimes you're going to have failures to meet the acceptance criteria as a protocol deviation. Sometimes you're going to have some other events that happen during the execution of validation activities and so on. In that process, we generate at times data that can be recycled or used to support a validation program, but sometimes we don't even understand what that data is and what is that we are collecting. So if we have an adequate protocol deviation SOP that has adequate categories, that is a good place to take a look and say, what data can I get out of this to give me a good view of my validation program first, the performance of the validation program from a quality perspective, and also the life cycle of my equipment systems and processes, right? Are we failing every time that we execute an autoclave validation protocol during a recall because the quality of that autoclave is inadequate because it's 25 years old and is obsolete, right? And then in the number of protocol failures or failures to meet the acceptance criteria, you get a real good idea of what's going on with a specific piece of equipment. So my recommendation is that we look at simple, straightforward, objective metrics, deviations per protocol, the total number of deviations that I have per protocol. And that's a blended number of all type of protocol deviations. But then you could break it down into the critical ones, right? Protocol deviation failures, right? Failures to meet the acceptance criteria per protocol. And what does that mean on a monthly basis? And what is the trend of that on a quarterly basis? And what that is that we see with specific pieces of equipment or processes. This type of data is very valuable, okay? So my recommendation is that you start with your protocol deviations and start looking at protocol deviations per protocol, break it down on the type of protocol deviations. And another very good and simple data set that we could develop is the number of validation repeat activities per protocol. Because every time that you have to repeat a validation activity, that means that you had a failure. That means you had a breakdown, whether it's on the process or the equipment. And there's some opportunity for improvement, whether it's on the validation process or in the equipment side, to be able to improve that metric.
So, Ivan, it sounds like having well-defined quality metrics and then really collecting the data and reviewing it often really helps you understand the life cycle of your processes and your equipment so that you are catching these things before you have a failure, correct?
Absolutely.
Right. So what, if you can, just for a brief moment, what exactly is it that we're looking for in our trend reports? Obviously, you're looking for certain things that are happening. Are we looking for, customer complaints? What are we looking for?
Well, it all depends. So if you're looking at product-related type of metrics, you want to look at those, right? You want to look at a holistic overview of the lot acceptance rate. How many lots I'm able to produce that are accepted and meet the critical quality attributes. That's an incredible indicator of quality, right?
Right.
If I have a 50% success rate on my production schedule, meaning that I'm failing 50% of the time to meet my CQAs, I have a problem. I need to take a look at that operation because from an operational perspective, you're wasting your time 50% of the time.
Right.
Right. The same with the product quality complaints rate. So if you have high product quality complaint rates, those are clear indicators you have a quality issue with your product that you are not detecting during testing. Okay, because the product is being released to the market. So you need to be able to establish one the operational definitions of these metrics, whether it's the product or validation. Secondly, you need to be able, along with the operational definition, is to define the trending program for those metrics, right? Give yourself a target that you're going to achieve on a frequent basis, whether it's monthly or per time that you review the metrics. And then every time that you're outside of that target or that trend is when you take a quick look and stop and say, what is going on here? Let's take a deep dive and integrating this with your requalification program, meaning the periodic reviews as well. We're going to talk a little bit about that later.
Right. Yes. Yes. So before we move forward with more talk about the actual metrics and implementing good metrics, just for the benefit of our listeners, I want to clarify what. Obviously, you've been talking about protocols and processes, and we're referring to internal protocols or the protocols that the company has adopted. But the FDA provided an updated guidance in 2016. Can you give us an overview of the FDA guidance document that refers to the submission of quality metrics data?
Sure. Absolutely. This is a revised guidance, right? I think they published the first one around 2015.
Right.
They came back on 2000. They came back on 2016 and revised the guidance, and they provided in the revised guidance on 2016. What the FDA is doing is that they are providing us an explanation on how CDER and the Center for Biologicals Evaluation and Research is going to utilize the submitted data and the quality metrics to help ensure that their policies and practices continue to support continuous improvement and innovation in the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. So when you look at what they did on this second revision of this document, is that they pretty much providing a little more explanation and guidance on how they intend to utilize the data. And I think that was driven because there was a little bit of potential skepticism from the industry when they first came out with this guidance document, telling us that we're looking at these metrics, we feel they're important, and it is volunteer to report. But I think that people understood that sooner or later the agency is going to come and make this mandatory, right? They're not going to issue a guidance with this, what I perceive as very good intent and approach of looking at quality metrics in the industry and then adopting policy internally in the FDA without coming sooner or later and coming to tell us that this is going to be voluntary, not voluntary, but something that is mandatory. But the intent and what they are looking at right now is initiating a voluntary reporting phase of FDA quality metrics. During that voluntary phase of the reporting program, the FDA is looking at accepting company submissions, right, of the data. I'm not sure how many companies are volunteering to provide data to the FDA at this point. I don't have that type of data. And then when you peel through the FDA guidance document, they're really providing very good information and details about the top three main categories of metrics that they're looking for. Lot acceptance rates, PQCR, product quality complaint rates, invalidated auto specification rates, critical buckets. But if you look further down on these guidance document, they go into a lot more detail on the type of metrics per main category that you can develop to look at your operation from a manufacturing perspective. And they, in one section, they're talking about lot acceptance rate data, and they suggesting about looking at the number of sellable lots started which are intended for primary packaging or distribution. So all these things are data and information that the industry should consider in their metrics program, and obviously take a holistic approach to the implementation.
Right. And obviously, whether it's voluntary or mandatory from the FDA, I mean, the guidances are really there to help people, to help companies have the highest quality that they can. And I mean, the long and short of it is, at some point, there's going to be an audit. And if you're not doing things to the best of your ability and producing the highest quality, whether it's based on the guidelines or not, those are going to be, cause for the regulatory agency to ask questions.
Of course.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's important to not only understand where these guidance documents are coming from in terms of suggestions, but also to make sure that you have the best processes and policies in place as an organization as you can. So jumping back in, Ivan, to the quality metrics themselves, what exactly do you think is needed to implement an adequate quality metrics program for validation in a pharma company?
Yeah, so in order to implement an adequate program for validation, you really need an adequate, well-written protocol deviation SOP with categories that provide objectivity to the process. What I mean by that is that if you only have two categories where you are lumping or putting all the different type of protocol deviations and events that are negative during the execution of validation, you might be diluting the data, right? You want to break it down on those type of events that you want to track and highlight that are critical to the validation program, that are key indicators of quality issues with the program or the system that it supports, and then have a good procedure that speaks to that speaks to the definition of those protocol deviations and the criteria for generating them and the criteria for documenting them. In addition to that, we need validation metric operational definitions, right? I need to define what are my expectations for all the individual metrics that I define. So in that way, it is very clear what are my quality indicators and what I'm tracking, right? Protocol deviations per protocol. Okay, this is the number of protocol deviations or events that we document during the execution of a protocol, opposed to protocol failures per protocol, which means from an operational definition that we are looking at the number of failures per protocol to meet the acceptance criteria during the execution of validation activities. The operational definitions are critical for consistency, objectivity, and tracking the correct information throughout the life cycle. You also need to be able to display the information, discuss it on a frequent basis. So my recommendation is that companies implement a tier board approach or performance boards that we are looking at reviewing and discussing validation matrix on a daily basis. Because you don't want to do this on a weekly basis. You don't want to do this on a monthly basis. You want to look at this on a daily basis to see what is happening, what's changing from a day to day, and then track it on a quarterly basis to have a big picture overview of the validation program and the overall metric. And then you need also data collection tools, right? Sure. Ideally, these should be electronic tools. Unfortunately, there's not that many available out there, probably 2 vendors. We could talk about that in a little bit. But the fact is that you need data collection tools, and it could be as simple as using Excel, which is what we are using currently in my company as well.
Okay. Sure. So having the right processes and protocols in place, and then having the right tools to track data, of course, is important. How can we account for key supply chain elements of supplier quality and distribution performance in our quality metric systems? Because we know that we rely on a lot of outside vendors for different products, services, audits, whatever. And how can we account for that in our quality metrics?
Absolutely. So you need to have adequate, relevant quality metrics for those type of processes, right? You have suppliers that provide you raw materials and components, right? So that individual process and what you are receiving should be measured and tracked, right? For example, number of raw material lots that meet the acceptance criteria. Ideally, you want to meet the acceptance criteria of the COA 100% of the time.
Sure.
Otherwise, you potentially have a problem because now you have to throw raw materials that don't meet your acceptance criteria against the vendor COA, right? So the metrics that you establish for the product, to an extent, as written on the FDA guidance document, can be extrapolated and customized for supply chain. Okay, for example, when you look at the distribution performance and stuff like that. So you look at relevant metrics. You could look at the numbers of lots shipped with no damage to the product or the packaging, right? Or looking at number of lots shipped with no temperature excursions when you're doing cold chain shipping as well. So it is about taking an objective look and looking at applying the concepts that the FDA is communicating to us in the guidance document and extrapolating and customizing that for the other processes as well.
So obviously you can use the data sets that you're tracking. You can use them to, as you mentioned several times, you can use them to find out where you're deficient or where there's a major problem. But I'm assuming you can also use these same metrics to improve efficiency. And,
of course.
Yes, and just, tighten up your processes over time. Can you talk a little bit about how that works with the?
Yes. So the way I done this, and I've seen it in other companies, large and obviously mid-size and small, is that there are two types of metrics for anything that we do, right? Especially on this industry. You're going to have two buckets: quality metrics, and those are key indicators of quality, and you're going to have productivity metrics.
Okay.
They are related to a significant extent. They do have an impact of each other, right? From an efficiency perspective, I'm concerned about cycle time, right? I want to understand the cycle time of my validation process, the cycle time of getting a protocol approved for execution, the cycle time of execution itself, the cycle time of closing a protocol during the review after execution. Those are three critical data points that speak to productivity and efficiency, right? Because you could identify bottlenecks in the process and areas of efficiency improvement by measuring those cycle times, right? Ideally, you want to have an overall cycle time of less than 5 days for the entire process. And some people are going to listen to this podcast and say, this guy is crazy, but it's very doable. We are currently doing it. And I've done it in other places where you have, in my previous life, cycle times of 3 days, which is pretty remarkable. But it's very doable once you start taking a more holistic look at your process and you have adequate productivity metrics. On another set of productivity metrics is the number of protocols per month. Because when you trend that data, you're going to see the spikes of workload that comes to your resources. You're going to understand better your resource allocation if you implement a resource model tool. So the productivity metrics are critical. They are needed because they go hand to hand with the quality metrics and they speak to the validation program itself.
Well said. Ivan, looking forward a little bit, how do you see quality metrics and PQS, pharma quality systems, adapting to the more technologically advanced pharma industry over time. We're seeing a lot more technology being introduced. We're talking AI and machine learning and all kinds of things. And so how do you see that evolving over time? And in that same vein, what role will the FDA play or continue to play in the oversight as we advance?
So I give you my 2 cents here. So this is definitely an area that is absolutely critical. Obviously needs development in the future, because managing a quality metrics program adequately, we need tools. Otherwise, you're going to have people spending a significant amount of their time tracking and managing the metrics when you're doing this manually. And I've seen it, for example, you sometimes have a person allocated 50 or 60% of the time just doing this, when it's ideal to be able to use that person to actually execute protocols, do technical operations work, resolve issues in the manufacturing floor, and improve the overall operation. So although the metrics are good, the fact that you're collecting them manually and you're allocating resources at 50 to 60% is obviously some level of inefficiency, right, in delivering something that is good. So to me, we need development what is really critical here is that we need electronic systems that are designed to meet the current needs of the industry, right? And the industry needs are continuously changing, especially in the validation arena.
Of course.
There are some tools, obviously, and there are a couple of options that are fairly good, and actually very good, as I've seen them before. And they are available. They actually participate on some of the IVT conferences by Genesis and NEAT, and they do provide some options that can be implemented to manage the validation metrics program. In terms of the role of the FDA, I tell you this, the role of the FDA will continue to grow and expand in this area. Initially, this is a voluntary program, but we all know that it's a matter of time before they're going to make it mandatory.
Sure.
So this is not going to go away.
Right. Okay. And obviously, as technology comes in, we're going to need to have tighter and tighter systems, because there's more things that we're going to have to watch, and that are areas that leave room for something to go wrong if we're not right. If we're not,
absolutely,
that it's accounted for in our protocols and in our processes.
Absolutely.
Well, that's some great information that you've shared today, Ivan. Before we close, I want to just see if you have any last thoughts or recommendations for our listeners around the quality metrics discussion in validation.
Absolutely. So I think that is very important to understand your validation program, implement adequate validation metrics that provide objective data of the health of our validated equipment, systems and processes, and the validation program itself, okay? To do so, make sure that you have an adequate protocol deviation SOP, that you have validation metric operational definitions that are adequate and objective in nature. You have tracking tools and mechanisms to review, discuss, and analyze the data frequency with the goal of continuous improvement. And if you're doing that, you are in the right place.
Excellent. Great way to wrap it up, Ivan. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here with us today. I do appreciate you taking time for us and for our listeners. I'd like to also say thank you to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. I also want to give a big shout out to all of you, our valued listeners. So if you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode, and be sure to share it with your colleagues in your online networks. For more information on this podcast and links to today's show, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.